Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to make our websites a lot more responsive. Hope you'll join. Hey there everyone. Today we're going to continue in our series on web development through focusing on a specific section of CSS that has to do with making our website accessible to almost any device you can think of. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, with the invention of the internet, as the years passed by, we found that we wanted to be able to access this information that we uploaded to this massive network on the go. As mobile phones added screens and we found different orientations for different devices, we found that we needed to build websites in order to accommodate for these multiple devices. Because in some cases, you might be better off designing, you might design something for a desktop and find that it doesn't work on a phone. And you might design something for a phone and find out that it doesn't really work well on a desktop. So because of that, the practice of responsive design is something that's commonplace in the world of web development now. So today we'll specifically focus on techniques and ways to make our websites more responsive, and specifically touch on the idea of media queries or breakpoints, so that we can adjust our website to look and style itself in different ways based on how large of a pixel width we have to work with. So to get started, let's go ahead and transition into our setup. So for today's setup, we're going to be setting up a pretty simple container with multiple cards inside of it. If you look at our code, what we have going on is essentially a div that acts as a container, as well as some nested divs within the container that we classified as cards. So we'll go ahead and set up an ID of container, and I won't place anything in there just yet, but just so we can visualize the card, I added a box shadow, some margin, some small text within the box, as well as a set width and height. Now with this, we can already start discussing why we would need something like responsive design. Because in a situation where our screen width is a lot larger, we end up with a scenario where we have a lot of extra white space, then it just kind of looks uncomfortable, uncanny, and not a great experience. And if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, we'll find that we could potentially be missing out on information that is vital to the exploration of the site and vital to communicating ideas to potential clients, to other potential people seeing your project. And it just isn't good practice. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into one of the first things we could do to create a more responsive design. So step one to creating a more responsive design within our websites will involve using different units of measurement when it comes to building things in web. Now, I'm sure I've used these measurements in projects before, but I'd really like to specify why I use these and why they're important to creating a better experience as a developer in context of making it easier for yourself down the road when you're building components and or elements within your web page, as well as just making things easier for everyone involved in the process, even the end user. But to begin, let's go ahead and start with a unit we're familiar with, and in this case we'll be talking about margin, or percentage I should say. So I'll eliminate the px here, and instead of 350%, I'm going to go ahead and switch it down to 35%. This way we'll get something similar to the size that we initially started with the 350 pixels, as well as creating something that stays consistent in context of size, no matter how large or small our viewport is. And as I say that, viewport will be something that is vital to understanding this responsive design. The viewport is our view into the web page and what the end user, or we see as a developer. Now, when it comes to the viewport, we'll always have access to a specific number, and that number being the width and height of the viewport. What matters to us right now in this scenario is the width, because with this, we can go ahead and use a percentage to calculate something like this. Now, as you can see, this isn't necessarily perfect. We'll find that even at a smaller size, even though you don't find phones this small in terms of width anymore, you can still have CSS elements grid, which is something we'll touch on later. But past percentages, which work both in the way of width and height, and should be something you consider different just because it's calculated based on the size of the screen, we will find that, let me go ahead and bring those down a bit, we'll find that you'll actually have to use a bit more percentage in terms of height if you wanted to make something like a perfect square. But that's something we'll touch on in a later episode. Past percentage, we have a very similar unit of measurement that is more accurate to the device. Earlier, I brought up Viewport because with percentages, we'll find that your width and height is calculated based on a number that isn't as responsive and or as updated as something like a virtual width or virtual height, which is calculated on the spot to create a better experience. So if I changed my percentage to VW, or virtual width, what the computer will do is calculate the width in a lot better way. And even here, you'll find that even we'll have the overlap just like before, but now instead we'll have to go a little bit farther just to get the same result. And if I switch this to virtual height, we'll see that we end up with a similar situation again, except for now we end up with something that's a lot more responsive and a lot more malleable to different platforms. So now moving forward, what we'll do is go ahead and focus on display methods that make responsive design a lot easier. Up until now, we've had our container empty. And the reason being is I wanted to go ahead and showcase what bad responsive design can look like if we don't have the correct display method in place. So for example, here, because this container displays in a block, we'll find that every block starts on a new line. Instead, I want these cards stacked together, and I want them to properly restack themselves based on the width and height of my viewport. So to do that, I'm going to use a CSS style that we're all familiar with at this point, and something we touched on our display methods. So with that, I'll go ahead and place my display property and give it a property value of flex. With this, we'll find that my flex box is automatically set to a row, and again, we'll adjust it to display. Well, actually, we want to set our flex direction to, let's say, we'll keep it this way, but let's say we want to add a wrap in order to accommodate for if these get too small. So I'll go ahead and use the property flex wrap and follow it with a wrap to essentially give it a true value. And in doing so, now our width is properly fulfilled. And if we extend things out, we'll find that things will properly stack if things get a little too small. And even here, we still run into the same issue, but you'll, again, never have a screen that small. Alongside that, we have CSS Grid that allows you to go ahead and set a width and value based on percentages, as well as changing the grid based on the media queries we touched on earlier. Just based on the length of this video so far and how much we can touch on, we'll be extending this episode into a 2 to 3 part series to touch on all of the best practices we can use to make our websites responsive. But for today, let's go ahead and continue with Flexbox and just some units that we can use to make our websites a lot better. So as the final subject of this video, we'll go ahead and touch on a query in a way, but not specifically the media query that we'd use for breakpoints just yet. To actually give you a bit of idea of how this would work, we'll go ahead and mess around with max width. With this, we can go ahead and set a specific width that would allow for the object to break at a certain point and or readjust based on specific viewport size. So, for example, if I wanted my blocks to not get this small, what I would do is go ahead and set a max width that's set on a more static and or non-changing number. For example, our virtual width is constantly calculated and is always based on the size of the viewport. But we know past a certain point, around 320 pixels, anything smaller than that just isn't really something that you'll see in an actual design. So in order to avoid the collapsing that we see with our elements here, what we could do is go ahead and provide a limit and or a minimum width, I should say, in order to stop it from squeezing to the size that it does. So what I'll do is go ahead and set a min width or a minimum width of 150 pixels. Now we'll see that when I squeeze down, we still have a normal sized card as well as being able to stack them thanks to our flex box. So with that, I want to wrap up today's episode and let you know that next week we'll specifically touch on media queries and ways that can improve our website's design and layout in order to create a better user experience for both mobile and web. So until then, have a nice week.